Greetings, loyal viewers, and welcome back to another countdown. So, this is what I'm going to be doing not only after the recent news of Season 2's comeback, but also the first Owl House video that I've done in quite some time, huh? Well, yes. Yes, I am. And you can't stop me. After all, in order to better understand and appreciate when the series does something really well, which, in my opinion, is a lot, you also have to be willing to acknowledge the low points as well. And as much as I love this show with all my heart, it's not devoid of episodes that either range from being merely okay to, what I would argue being pretty bad. Not terrible, but pretty bad. Which is precisely how this list is going to be ordered, just FYI. That said, I know there's liable to be a few choices on this list that's probably going to piss a lot of people off, but it is important to emphasize that this is still my opinion, and if you happen to really like any of these episodes I'm about to list here, that's great. I'm glad that you can get a lot more out of these than I could. These are just ones that either didn't leave as big of an impression on me as the rest of the series as I would have hoped, or is just not that good in general. So with that said, let us begin the countdown in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, I'm probably already going to get quite a bit of flack for putting this episode on the list in general, but I did say in the beginning that episodes on this list I feel aren't necessarily bad, and that's generally how I feel about this episode as a whole. Now, that's not to say that it ain't devoid of flaws, because, well, it wouldn't be on the list otherwise, but like I said, it's nothing too bad. The episode is about Luce, who, still feeling uncertain about Ida's training methods, sneaks into a magic school called Hexside, both to help her new friend Willow pass her Abomination class, as also a means to stick it to Amity, who we'll get to in a minute, and to learn as much as she can about magic. All the while meeting other characters like Willow's only other friend Gus, as well as Principal Bump near the end there. Meanwhile, Ida and King are making a dare that in which ultimately ends up going south, especially for King, and alongside that, Luce is eventually revealed and hijinks ensued, lessons are learned for the most part, and it ends on a admittedly kind of funny note there.
You high five with your hands, not your head.
So remember when I mentioned earlier about them sticking it to Amity? My issue with that, in terms of its overall execution at least, is that while I can definitely accept Willow doing this to get a passing grade, since, let's be completely honest, we've all done it at least once before. I'm not condoning it, mind you, but we've all done it before. Hell, I even know some college students that still do it. She definitely, though, did not earn the top student badge. Now, granted, that can be more blamed on the teacher than on her, but she still willingly accepts it and all that. Now, don't get me wrong, Amity in this first episode is a complete and utter jackass, but as would be further proven in episodes like Convention, for example, she practically worked herself to the bone to get where she's at. Now, in hindsight, we know why that was the case, but still. Not that it excuses her crappy behavior, but that doesn't exactly make Willow right in this instance either. In other words, two wrongs don't make a right. Though, to be completely fair, that also doesn't justify Amity nearly getting Luce dissected after selling her and Willow out to Principal Bump. Generally speaking, that's probably my biggest issue with the main plot in this episode in particular, in that, quite frankly, no one looks good here. And keep in mind, this is our introduction to these characters. That's not exactly a great first impression if you ask me. Now, in this episode's favor, I'll at least give it credit that, along with a few funny lines from Luce, the B-plot with Ida and King and their dare I found to be kind of amusing, especially with Ida realizing that Luce has snuck into Hexside, and Wendy Malick just absolutely kills it here. It's honestly pretty funny.
No, blind obedience.
Hexable system time! Let's get memorizing!
No! Pointless busy work. No! Why? School!
And the ending with Luz coming to understand and better appreciate Ida as her mentor, while you can certainly argue is a bit questionable in its overall execution, especially now in hindsight, is still kind of nice to see. The episode overall, while certainly not abominable, is unfortunately nothing too special either, and will certainly not be getting an A+ from me anytime soon.
Aww, it's like mine, but much smaller and meaningless.
Yeah, unlike some of the entries, I'm definitely going to get a lot of crap for not putting this higher, as I know plenty of fans that generally do not like this episode, especially now. And to be fair, it's not like I can't see why, as I'm about to point out here in a minute. In this first episode, Luz is being sent to a summer camp as, quite understandably, her mother Camila feels like her creativity is getting a bit too out of hand here. She accidentally stumbles upon a portal to the magical world known as the Boiling Isles, where she befriends Ida and her roommate King, and in order to get home, Luz must help them with a mission involving breaking into the Conformatorium and getting King's crown back. All the while, Luz meets others in the Conformatorium who are imprisoned for their own strange oddities and whatnot. Okay, so the main problem I generally have with this one is somewhat similar to the last one, though in a largely different sort of way. Now, while I, as someone who is autistic, do like the moral itself about not being shamed and even sometimes imprisoned just for being strange and or different, not only does it end up feeling a bit confused in the fact that Luz's strange behavior did in fact cause quite a bit of problems back home, but they hammer it into you like crazy in the second half. Like I said, it's a good moral on its own, don't get me wrong, but I don't need it to be directly told, at least not more than once. I'm not going to be too hard on other aspects like the comedy, action, and world building and whatnot, as it is the first episode, and let's be completely real here, with very rare exceptions, a lot of shows usually don't tend to start off the strongest. That said though, there are some things I generally like about it. Firstly, while I do think the character introductions could have been better, I do at least like the way the world building is handled here. Secondly, while I don't particularly like the way the moral is handled in the second half, the fight against Warden Wrath I thought was actually kind of fun, with even a few admittedly funny moments leading up to it.
Ow! Oh, I hate it when that happens.
But other than that though, as first episodes go, it's certainly not the worst I've ever seen, and in my opinion doesn't quite deserve the hate it often gets. But, much like the moral itself, it still leaves a lot to be desired. Okay, last controversial pick/placement, I promise, as I know that with all the detractors out there, there's also plenty of others that do like this episode fine. And don't worry, I'll get to the best part of this episode here in a minute, so just hear me out on this one. In this second episode, Luz wakes up after the previous one and is ready and eager to finally start her training, only to find Ida being mostly disinterested, though it could also be like me when I wake up early in the morning. She explains to Luz that becoming a witch takes a lot of time and work, and since Luz is under her teaching, she will have to work for her staff, and by that I mean manual labor. Ida gives Luz potions to deliver to the locals of Bonesborough. She of course eventually meets a seemingly friendly wizard who gives Luz a map for a magical quest, during which she begins to wonder if she's actually a quote-unquote chosen one. Not a bad setup in all honesty, and the ending is a really solid one, both in how genuinely heartfelt it is and how it mostly sets things in motion for the rest of the series, with how it outright deconstructs the whole notion of a chosen one. And, well, I think I'll just let Ida say the rest here.
Look, kid, everyone wants to believe they're chosen. But if we all waited around for a prophecy to make us special, we'd die waiting. And that's why you need to choose yourself.
Does that mean you'll give me a magic staff of my own?
Not yet, but someday.
So what's my problem with this episode as a whole, you might be wondering? Well, I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for saying it, but in a word, boring. So little happens in this episode, and aside from maybe a couple of minor giggles, the comedy I don't even think is strong enough to really carry it throughout. I don't know, there just really isn't much to say here, hence why, even though I still ended up putting it on the list to begin with, I couldn't really bring myself to put it any higher despite how mostly dull it is. Which is really upsetting that such a good ending like this had to be put alongside an episode that honestly just leaves so little impact on me. Usually an ending of this caliber can save a movie, episode, game, or whatever, but in this case, it's the only good part of a dull quest that, in my opinion, is simply not worth partaking in. Oh yeah, now we're really getting into the meat of this list. While it's a little hard for me to say whether or not I'd call this a bad episode as a whole, it is part of a much bigger problem I had with Season 1, but we'll get to that. The story is simple enough. Luce and the gang go to a local carnival where King quickly becomes rather envious of Luce spending more time with her other friends, Willow and Gus, than with him. King, very stupidly, confides in a fortune teller who is actually Tibbles from an earlier episode and makes his wish a reality. But it comes at a cost, and, in spite of the name of the episode, a pretty big one at that. The episode is largely filler to be fair, but to its credit, it is always kinda nice just seeing the gang having fun and all and just shooting the shit. So, why did I put it this high on the list and even higher than the previous two? Well, remember when I said how this episode was part of a bigger problem? Well, it's because King himself, I feel, largely dragged this episode down for me. Now, don't get me wrong, I like King a lot, most of the time, but geez, Season 1, in my opinion, did him really dirty in terms of him being a main focus in an episode. This is something that, for the most part, Season 2 did a lot better in my honest opinion, but that's a video for another day. Here though, and especially in the next episode on this list, he's pretty insufferable. Now, in this episode at least, not only do I understand his motivations a little bit more than in the next episode, but he does make more of a genuine effort to apologize for his actions in an admittedly nice way that ties into what he and Luce were originally doing when they got here. But it barely felt like it was enough for what he did, which was still pretty messed up in its own right. Even if, let's be fair, he didn't mean for things to go this far south. Also, I generally just don't care for Tibbles whatsoever. I know we're not meant to like him and whatnot, I get that, but even in that regard, he just does nothing for me. I will admit though, the side plot with Ida I thought was kind of funny, especially this line.
You guys owe me! There's nothing happening in this show!
Not a single one of those dumb kids have gotten hurt yet.
Dumb kids? Wait. Those are my dumb kids!
Aside from all that though, it's just a bit too unpleasant for me, even if it's not quite as bad as the last two entries. And on that note... Oh yeah, you all probably saw this one coming a mile away. It's a bit of a shame too, because despite being at the number 2 spot, I do at least like how this episode goes over how the writing process is often done, the compromises that often have to be made between different writers, and of course, moments like these.
I think a little romantic tension could help the scene.
Hey, there's more to life than shipping.
Don't you dare insult shipping in my presence.
Apprentice?
Some of the best books were written in literal crunch time.
That's a toxic mentality that contributes to burnout and unrealistic expectations.
But even more so than the last entry, King really dragged this episode down in a big way. There's a massive book fair going on in town, and Luce and King decides to write their own book, but of course they, most notably King, cannot make any compromises with each other's visions. And while Luce walks out of the room for a bit, he completely alters the story and trashes all of her ideas, even killing off her Lazura character. Completely and justifiably hurt by his actions, Luce leaves King to complete the novel on his own. King then publishes his finished novel with the help of a shady publisher named Pennyette. All the while, Luce ignores and even initially rejects his invitation to his party, though she reluctantly agrees to go on her own merit. Of course, once he realizes he can't write a good, coherent story without Luce after Pennyette laughs off his initial final draft of the sequel, he asks for her help, preceded by him mocking her ideas and describes his motives to alter it again like he did before. Luz pretty much just says screw you and walks off before getting captured by Pignette, with King following suit, and are put in a steadily shrinking box. Once again, King acts like a total ass, and after a much cathartic scolding from Luz, apologizes for his actions, and they narrowly manage to escape. There's also a B-plot involving Ida and her sister Lilith that actually ends on an admittedly kind of touching moment between the two, and here I am more or less wondering why the hell this couldn't have been the episode that we got instead. So, yeah, there's really not too much else to say here. It's just an outright unpleasant mess, with maybe a few halfway decent elements to it. If they had just toned down King's douchiness by just a few notches and maybe did a bit more with the B-plot, I honestly wouldn't have even had it on here on the list to begin with, let alone at number 2. Unfortunately though, not only is it very disappointing in a lot of ways, but its title is about as much of a textbook example of being accurate to a fault. Now, before we get to the number 1 pick, a couple of dishonorable mentions. Hootie's moving hassle. A decent amount of early development for Willow at the very least, even if the rest of the episode is mostly standard. Although, considering Hootie, it could have been a lot worse. Something ventured, someone framed. Matholomew sucks, but thankfully he was not quite bad enough to sink the rest of the episode for me. Plus, Ida's plot here really helped to save this episode from making on the list. Though if this were a top 7 list, this would definitely be on number 7 without a doubt. And the number 1 worst episode of Season 1... Yep, arguably the most hated episode of Season 1 for a number of reasons, but we'll get to what those are here in a second. After a disagreement on how to make the shop stand flashy, and with King feeling a bit underappreciated, Ida decides the best way to share perspectives is with that of a body swap episode. So Luz is now Ida is now King, and King is now Luz. King Luz ends up running with some rowdy teenagers and briefly taking control of their social clique. Ida King gets trapped in a cat-themed cafe, and Luz Ida is out of the story for a disconcertingly long amount of time till near the end, before making the shop stand out like she wanted it to, only to get arrested and almost put in the Emperor's Coven by Lilith. And don't worry, I'll talk a bit more about that here in a minute. They all reconvene, Ida turns them all back, and they get away from the authorities and the chaos in the nick of time. Only for it to eventually end like they seemingly learned their lesson, but of course, Luz ends up with cleaning duty anyway. So yeah, if you know anything about how body swap episodes are usually done, you can pretty much see the problem here. Only it's honestly so much worse here. Why? Well, as you can see, not only do they swap voices, which, in my opinion, goes from nearly killing the suspension of disbelief for the most part, to downright desecrating the corpse, particularly with Luz in Ida's body being interrogated by Lilith. Now look, I might be willing to let this slide with Ida and King's plotlines to a certain extent, which, by the way, each of their side of the story has titles attached to them, which is honestly kind of pointless. But are you seriously meaning to tell me that friggin' Lilith, of all people, or witches I guess I should say, cannot tell that that's not Ida? Cause, let me tell you, this moment made me facepalm my forehead so hard, I think I ended up like Sokka at the end of The Cave of Two Lovers. On top of all that, I think I only lightly giggled at a couple moments throughout. Once was with Ida learning the dark truth behind the cafe she's trapped in, and the ending, while certainly a bit cruel to be sure on Luz's end, still made me chuckle a little bit admittedly. Other than that, the only mildly interesting thing, ironically, in Luz's plotline was learning a bit more about how Ida originally wanted to be in the Emperor's Coven alongside Lilith, but as I'm sure many of us know by now, she eventually decided against it. And this would thankfully be expanded upon in one of the season's best episodes, which we'll be discussing more about that when we get to that countdown. In the end, it's just an insufferably dumb episode, and thankfully in my opinion, they would never stoop to such a level, as this further proves that sometimes whatever happens once should just stay that way. And those are my top 6 worst episodes of Owl House Season 1. Did you agree with my choices? Were there others that you thought were worse? Well, be sure to leave a comment down below. And to balance this list out for next week, I'm going to be doing my top 8 best Owl House Season 1 episodes, so definitely stay tuned for that. And until then, I'm King Gargantuas, and take care.